Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really honored to be hosting two absolutely brilliant teams who are pushing boundaries and breaking barriers in the food industry. Chef Minh Phan, a proud Angeleno who has been cooking professionally for over 2 decades, and she currently helms two critically acclaimed restaurants, Porridge and Puffs and Phenokite. Phenokite was started as a one-off pop-up hosted at Second Home Hollywood. It was conceived in 10 days, and eventually it was named LA Times Restaurant of the Year last 10 years. That's quite an accomplishment. And Charlotte Druckman, a fantastic journalist and food writer who also edited and conceived the James Beard Award-winning collection, Women on Food. This event is part of Second Home program. For those who are new to Second Home, we are a creative, community-focused workspace and cultural venue with locations in London, Lisbon, and LA. And without further ado, will now hand over to them to kick off the conversation. But just before I do, I just wanted to say that we will be answering some of your questions towards the end. If you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can towards the end. Thank you so much again.
Okay, we're starting. Hi, I'm Charlotte. A quick correction. My book was only nominated for a James Beard Award. It didn't win. I still love it, but I feel like it's important to correct that stuff. I am so excited to be here. I'm just excited to talk to Minh, and we are going to do something a little different today. Normally, I would have this list of very sort of like thought out formal questions, and I would just assault her with them, which is a typical interview style way of doing things. But when we first talked, we just kind of like boom, boom, boom off of each other. We both seem to have a very similar perspective. Part of it we think might be our age. We're not sure. So we're just gonna kind of get into it. It's not gonna be traditional. We may go on tangents, but we're going to, I hope, keep it fun and I hope everyone thinks and laughs. That is our goal today. So my first question is a little bit typical, but I'm still gonna mess with it slightly. I would like to know, because I think it's useful for everyone listening, Minh, how you got here. Like how, I mean, I guess very literally, but also just how you got to Porridge and Puffs and now Phenokite. And I want you to tell me this sort of the two versions of this. I want you to tell me from your perspective what you've been doing and what it was like to do it and what the sort of media version of that story is.
Okay, let's start with Phenokite. Phenokite is pretty, my version of Phenokite is my good friend Laura saw the Second Home space. She was looking at a space for her nonprofit. And she, our film company and a mission-driven film company. And she saw the space and it was during COVID, no one was there. She's like, this kitchen is empty. You should come cook here. And I said, Laura, I need another kitchen or restaurant. Like I need a hole in my head. I can't do it. And she's like, no, it'll be great. We can like get all these nonprofits together and blah, blah, blah. So long story short, you don't say no to Laura Kim. And I went and met her and I saw the space. I'm like, whoa, wait, hold on. And then I went home and then I couldn't stop thinking about it. Meanwhile, we were knee deep in a collaboration with Nikki and Carol, Nikki Nakayama and Carol, Ida and Nakayama of Anaka, which was very intense. I have already put my team through the ringer by changing menus over and over again, pivoting from Porridge and Puffs takeout to more of a multi-course takeout just because I felt like people needed it. Very, very hard on an incredible team. But you know what? They are so wonderful and, they helped me out that first week and it was a shit show. But Bill Addison walked in. I did not know how he looked like. I did not know who he was. I knew everyone, but he does slide under the radar pretty well. And then he wrote about it. And that's the story of my life is I tend to come up with these projects and someone slides in and then they write about it. It happened with Jonathan Gold and Porridge and Puffs. So it was hard. It was really, but it was wonderful. And then I concepted so fast. I threw, bubble gum at the wall and then something stuck and then some things didn't. But the thing about throwing bubble gum at the wall is you have to throw a lot of bubble gum and you just keep having to dodge the ones that fall on you. But that's the way life is. And there is some casualty, which I take full responsibility for. And it's is an impetus for me to COVID was hard. And, but it's an impetus for me to make how to make it better for people who aren't, who are doing the collaborative work day to day, the workers, the team.
How do you think when the media presents these restaurants and you and your work, do you feel like they're representing that experience, or do you think it gets sort of like buffed and polished a little bit? Or what do you think that, I mean, maybe it is accurate. I who am part of said media tend to be pretty skeptical of it, and sometimes I'm pleasantly surprised.
Well, the funny thing is no one writes about us. People, you think that everyone writes about us, but it's very, very, there are very few people who write, journalists who write about us. So I think, number one, they don't know about us. And number two, I think we're kind of it's a lot because people will start stories and they'll start talking to me and they're like, this is too difficult to wrap our head around because I'm so mission and anthropological driven that I'm like, no, it's more than just beautiful food photos. It's really something that I thought about a lot. And this is my critique / expression of what's going on in the world right now. And I think that people really don't want to write about that, to be honest with you. So they just kind of skip over my story and they're like, no, just give me why AAPI, hate is important to you. I'm like, let me give you the historical, and this is why we do this, and this is why I do this, and this is why servers are like, I don't want to be a servant. I want to be of service and on my terms. And then it gets too complicated. And then a lot of times they'll just kind of the story will go away. It's really funny how often that happens. A lot of people want to talk to me, but once they get it, this is why I appreciate you so much. It's like, it's harder for me to get a true, a true place to talk about these things than one would think. So, but the people who do write about it extensively do get it pretty right, because they spend a lot of time with me.
Yeah, I think I can say from the perspective of being a frustrated food writer, I think that there are some of us that really want to get into all of those details. We want, like for me, there's nothing I like more than working with a really cerebral chef. Like I find that the most, I am mission driven, but just that I love seeing all those layers, like things that you would never know went into a dish or an idea. I think that's so interesting. And I think you guys get punished for it, but we get punished for it too as writers, because our editors are like, well, what's the Hollywood pitch version of that?
Yeah.
They want things to sort of fit into something familiar. On the other hand, and I could be wrong, but I feel like the one exception to this is that if you're like a white male chef and you're doing something very complex and very cerebral or intellectual, or and it might not even be, the funny thing is it might not be about studying the history and going into sociology and anthropology. It might just be that they're playing with new gadgets, but for some reason they then get presented as these very smart, thoughtful chefs. And so I kind of feel like it's a little bit of a trap,
You nailed
it. Yeah.
It's like they love listicles. They love like top 15 chefs, top 17, blah, blah, blah. You should be watching it. And I'm like, it does me no service to be on it. I love celebrating women and I love the camaraderie in the community, but I don't think those lists are well serviced. It's just like, I'm like, oh, I should, I hate lists, number one, just like get to know the person deep down inside. And I think even though it's called the culinary arts, I don't think people see it as art a lot. you know, and
Yeah.
but it is the highest form of art. It's ephemeral art. We're interpreting, you know, how we're interpreting and communicating with people through food. I mean, I don't think so. That's art to me, but I don't think people see it that way. When they see art, they see visual, modern Netflix chef's table kind of things. And I'm like, it's more complicated than that. And that is such through a lens of very specific aesthetics, that, you know, and it's like an established aesthetics. It's like a dark background, moody music, you know, whatever.
Yeah. And
And
it's also the irony of not seeing the work as a form of art, but wanting so badly to portray those same white male chefs in the same way they portray artists, right? There's that very romantic sense of them as these sort of heroes who are enduring challenges. And, you know, it's hard to be so talented. It's hard to be an artist in the world.
so
But
hard
on
to
the
get,
other hand,
get broken up with. You know, it's like they go through divorce. You know what? They had a mom who didn't love them. I'm like, fuck you. That's 90% of the world.
I know. And so it's kind of infuriating because the actual work itself, which they often are doing the least amount of, does not get looked at as the art part, but they somehow are treated as though they are very special artists. And so obviously, like, that's, you know, that's a really big problem. And I also just feel like, which, you know, you started saying too, but and we can get into this now, which is that it's when it is an art, when it's supposed to be artistic, it's very, very one-dimensional, and it's very much coming from a Western European sense of food, art, culture. It's all coming out of that. So again, this idea that there could be an art of cooking. I always think about like China. Like China had, I mean, obviously times have changed in China, but historically, if you go back, Chinese food was like freaking unrivaled. That was, you want to talk about an art form. Like you just want, you know, you go and back and you look at all that stuff, but that's definitely not treated like art, you know? So there, again, it's like, it's so limited. The idea of what is considered even technically challenging or important or relevant is like, it's so limited. And I wanted to get into that with you too, because like one of the things we sort of talked about was this idea of labels and words and whether or not they mean anything at all. So, you know, when someone calls you a woman chef, or when someone calls you an activist, what do those things mean to you? You know, and again, it's like, does anyone call you an artist? Probably not. But there are these other terms that they like to use for you, and I think that they're loaded. And we talked about this, so you can kind of get into it from your own perspective of kind of the boxes you've been put into, and you know how you work with that.
I mean, I think I do all that. I mean, I think that's a good thought. It's like, number one, putting me in a box is really hard, but people try to because it's easier to write about. And I love doing you know, being an activist. I love working, but I don't think I should be described as such because that's not what I really do. You know, I think my work as a whole, holistically, is an act, and there's activism in it, and there's rebellion, and there's protest. But at the end of the day, that's what an artist does, is they use their medium to be an activist, to have an expression. But I think it's much more soft and wonderful to call a woman of color an activist, I think, you know, rather than an artist. And I think that's something that I do contend with a lot. I'm like, okay, you know what, but so does, you know, there's plenty of other artists who, you know, are artists, and then they, you know, incorporate activism in their work. But why are they, you know? So it's really, I mean, there is a lot of gender politics going on, as well as color, you know, identity politics, which, you know, we would hope that by now people would kind of get. But you know, I come from a place where I don't begrudge it. I actually be like, hey, that's okay. How do we incorporate that? How do we, I tend to have a lot lighter tread when something doesn't sit right with me. Is I sit and I contemplate. I'm like, why did that person say it that way? What made them say it that way? And I don't really discount it as them not know. I don't really discount and say, well, they don't know better. I think it's like I blame it a little bit on the system. I'm like, systematically, this is what they think I look like and I should be, and my work looks like, rather than really seeing it through a much more critical lens and putting it on the same playing field as others.
To me, I've been thinking about it since we first talked about it. And I've been thinking about how, in some ways, and this scares me a little bit, once people realized that it wasn't okay to dismiss someone as an angry woman, and that was more of a sort of personal dig, but it's sort of like if you are and at all angry, if you are trying to talk back even, which isn't even necessarily anger, right, but you get perceived that way, if you do that in the professional sphere and you're a woman, then it's like you're an activist basically. Like I kind of think that they're on the same spectrum. It's just that it's more appropriate, shall we say, to use that when you're having a professional conversation. But there's something strangely, it's almost like I always think, because people will, I've been called an activist and I'm like, I'm just doing my job. My job is to be a conduit. My job as a journalist is to report what stories that I think are interesting, that I think matter. Certainly I have an agenda because I have particular beliefs that are going to dictate what I choose to write about. But there's nothing of activism in that. It's just that you think I'm going against the grain or I'm pointing at something that doesn't follow the standard. And so you're just calling that activist. So it's very, I don't know, like I just feel like it's not a critique so much, but it feels like a diminishment of activism at the same time as it's also not really quite paying attention to what the work being done is, you know?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. It's like, and it's very easy to reduce the work to something that is understandable, but the work is so much more layers, so many more layers than just being one thing. And I think that's I think that's a general problem right now. And it makes sense because how much information can we all absorb? We do people, society has a lot of shortcuts. I think different generations have a lot of shortcuts. I think the way things are done, there's a lot of shortcuts. There's a lot of the big A, automation. How do you quickly get information and conveniently get information rather than thinking for yourself, and thinking about making your own opinions? And I think that's a lost art. So
It's also extremism too, right? It's kind of like a word like activist is another way of saying radical or left. People don't call people who fight for the right activists, right? Like we wouldn't be like, wow, that pro-Trump or anti-vaxxer is like really putting themselves out on the line. What an activist, right? So it's always also used in that way to sort of, it's like, you know, it's dangerously close to being like you're a liberal, you're a radical. And so there's also that kind of in it too, which before I wouldn't have thought of, but now that we did have to go through the era of Trump where everything was kind of like, we're going to put them in one camp and make them look horrible. And then we're going to all gather our hateful selves in one camp, like it. So yeah,
yeah, I hate polarization. I think it sounds really funny, but I am kind of anti anything that's extreme one way or another. And I think that's the way it's been in the last decade, definitely during Trump era. And I think, and it makes sense for young people because it's like you have to pick a side so you get momentum to fight for what you want. And I've been there as a young person, but as someone who's a little older now, I think it's nicer for me to stand back and be like, okay, what has worked? What hasn't worked? I think, as you and I have said before, it's like we really are proud Gen Xers. We really think we're the most, I'm going to quote you on it, Charlotte. We're the most equipped generation to kind of move forward and take care of the world, and how, and how this is going to be done. And I think about that a lot. I think about what are our generational duties, how are we different, how do we look at, and I think I'm pretty liberal, but that doesn't exclude me from trying to listen to others and from the other side. And I think
No.
that's really missing from the world.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I have here written down from you, less struggle, more hustle. And I was like, I was like, before we get really into the Gen X thing, because then we may really like lose everybody. But when you said that, I think that that's like an excellent model. And it is what we were talking about for the restaurant industry, right? Which is like, how do you put yourself in a situation where it's not everything is focused on struggle and it's just about like hustling to get the work done. So I'm wondering if you could talk about this motto and how you apply it.
It's really funny. It took actually Connie one of our old sous chefs. She told me that because I think as a Gen Xer, I tend to struggle a lot. I like the struggle. I have always been taught that you should struggle for your art, blah, blah, blah. And I think, and it kind of opened my eyes, and she goes, can we just struggle a little less and just hustle more? And it's something that I do take, it's pretty cool. It's something that I do take from a younger generation, because for me, it's like I overthink, like it's in me to overthink everything. It's in me, like if I'm not struggling, it's not worth it to do. But I think for them, it's like, like I mean, of course they say this and it's like everything is a struggle. But I think for me, it does give a lot of perspective that you just do more, do better, like just because you put struggle in it doesn't mean it's better.
No, and it's also if you focus too much on the struggle, this is where it's funny because I think the struggle thing, this is definitely a generalization, but I think the struggle thing comes from we were a generation that was, raised to be very not just idealistic, but idea driven in terms of having these goals. Like you have this thing that you're working towards. And unfortunately for millennials, they grew up in an economically unstable world where it wasn't about what is my plan for the future. It was about what do I do now? So if you are dreaming of some wonderful future, it feels like a struggle every time you get beaten down, because it's like, I just want to make my goal. If you don't even have a goal like that in mind, it's funnily enough, I think easier, but it's why, we look at millennials sometimes and we're like, why are you just like going from one thing to the next? Like, but that's the hustle. That's like also about just like picking yourself up and just like go, 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 go,
And I feel really bad I honestly, hearing that, I feel really bad for millennials, because I think for me, like I think a lot of Gen Xers, if I look back at my collegiate goals and my high school goals and my goals in the last 30 years, it's one simple thing. It sounds so basic, but I'm like, just to make humans live a little bit better, that's it. I never wanted a house. I don't, if that came with a certain condition or it came, I'm like, oh, cool. I never, like, I tell my team every day, I can eat packaged ramen every day and will give up anything for my art any day, or for any of you any day. And I have no qualms about it, because no one told me I needed to own a house by a certain age. No one told me. And even if they did, I'm like, or get married to a certain person or be with someone, or, all the prescribed world, Sex in the City stuff I knew early on, like, that's not for me. That's really dumb. And I think that's empowering and liberating. And I think that's why the goals are such long-term. I'm like, I just want to live a good life and give back to this world. It's so simple. And how do you fill that time with, something challenging and fun and know who you are? That's the challenge. And I think when you have these external goals, what I feel like millennials have a lot more of, it's like, I think that's really hard, because I actually was interviewing someone and they're like, what's going on with the Michelin? Or you want your Michelin? I'm like, I don't care if I fucking get a Michelin. I'm like, I'm just going to do the work, because the work itself is so much fun. And you know what? And these are the criteria of Michelin. And you know what? Why wouldn't I strive to give my guests the best service? Why wouldn't I try to, like, you know, feed people more and sustainable and environmentally be more conscious and take care of my team a little bit more. Why wouldn't I try to be the best? Like, this is like, these are things I would do with or without the Michelin. Unfortunately, you know, sometimes their standards are a little bit misguided in terms of how they actually choose. But that being said, I'm like, I'm not going for that. I'm going for just doing the right thing. And I think doing the right thing is so, it's inner. It's like so much of me is about, I don't listen to anyone from the outside. I do, but I'm like, whatever. It's about who I am inside. And it's like this certain fearlessness that's so liberating that I wish to pass on to people. But I don't know how to share that because it seems so glib to be like, it could get worse. Just do what you want to do and just don't worry about that.
I do think it's generational, just in that we were this special generation. If I compare it to like my parents' generation, and I look at like my dad, for example, I think this idea that you could love what you do, that was what made you choose what you did, like that was a novelty. Most, you know, the generations that preceded us, it was like, you just work because you work. That's it. Like, that's it. And for us, it was no, like we work because it has meaning to us. We work because we love it, because we care. And I'm not sure if, and I'm sad that that hasn't gotten passed down. And I would like to see that come back, because it really, yeah, it can make you workaholic, but it also means that you always feel like you have this purpose that you're passionate about. And it really helps you get through things. But it also comes with, I think the other side of it is, as you were talking, it also relies on a certain kind of self-awareness. You have to have the self-awareness to know what that thing is for you, to know what it means for you, and to be able to shut out what other people around you are saying, you know, to really know yourself and be like, that's all fine. I understand it. That's great. I respect it. This is me. This is what I'm doing. And like, that is a thing that it just, you know, hopefully as people grow up, maybe they get more of it, but it's kind of a crapshoot, I think, in a lot of ways. Like,
And it's amazing because it is very it's very Gen X. And I think it's because we were left alone a lot. I mean, we were the garage, you know, the garage
yeah,
tinker generation, the latchkey generation. I mean, we were kind of left alone a lot. So, and I think like in our generation, I think it's like, it's not so much that, you know, we were given given permission to do whatever we want. I think we did have parents that say, just be happy, because they saw how unhappy people can be.
yeah,
And I just think, like, I went to Vietnam maybe a decade ago. And then I asked a little kid, I'm like, hey, what do you want to be when you grow up? Because that's like, you know, that's what you ask kids, right? That's how you start a conversation in the United States. And it's like, you know, free, you know, it's freedom and it's capitalism. And the kid and the parents just like stop me. They're like, you're so American. You don't ask a kid what they want to do. They just are going to go do whatever it takes to make them money and survive. And I'm like, whoa, that blew my mind. And I'm just like, and I was so naive at the time, you know, maybe 2 decades ago. And it was like, it kind of blew my mind. And I just think it's very generational. And I think it is such a privilege for our generation that I think we truly believe it. You know, 'cause I know people who came after me, and I know my kid, you know, I know my kid, and like they truly have the ability to do whatever they want. They are so much more. The thing is, no one talks about how financially secure millennials are. They always like, we're struggling. I'm like, dude, who do you think's gonna gain all that wealth when the boomers die? Gen X
yeah.
don't give a fuck, and we do.
Exactly. It's not coming to us.
No, we don't want it. We don't want to be responsible for it. We don't want to play by the rules. We've already said fuck you to the whole system. You're going to gain all this, millennials, and you better do something good with it. But then there's always this fear and this struggle and to find, it's like this scarcity is not real, because the thing is, for me, like, scarcity is real. I see it. I'm like, shit, I can't afford that. And I'm like, I'm like, okay, you're really freaking out. But why did you just go buy like $50 worth of craft beer and then spent it on this coffee and then had to go meet your friend at Cope? You know, I'm like, this is like not. And they're like, but that's the, you know, and a phone bill with a lot of data. I'm like, I just don't get it. So
But
I'm
it's
like, this is what
kind
you're mad at
of,
me.
even though it was preposterous, it is, it, when you say it this way, do you remember that someone wrote that op-ed piece about how the reason that millennials were never going to be homeowners was that they were spending all their money on avocado toast? And everyone was like, that's ridiculous and totally outraged. The millennials were really upset about it. But like when you describe it that way with like the craft beer and the coffee and stuff, I'm like, well, it's kind of like, yeah, you're just eating all the avocado toast that you're paying too much money for. And okay, so I want to from that segue into one of my other notes is about eating ramen, you and your team eating ramen while you're meanwhile serving your guests fine dining food. And I'm wondering too, just like, I know this is a bit of an annoying question, but right now it's so interesting to me with like 11 Madison Park doing a vegan menu, or, I'm really curious when you think about fine dining and what you want it to be, what that looks like. Like,
It's for me, of course, it's the food. That's always going to be about the food and about my exploration, but that's very personal, right? Because that's my form of expression. I think when we think about systematically, for me, and about the guest, I think about the guest and about our team a lot. I think that's more important to me. Like that's like a bigger, issue. And I draw Venn diagrams all day. I'm like, this is where I want to be. This is where I am. This is where we are right now. And I do that all day. And I think for me, it's like food wise, I'm going to keep exploring and pushing. That's my life's work. That's not going to change. I'm just going to, figure out ingredients, go forage more, go discover new stuff, discover new techniques. I think that is a given. And that's what I love to do. It's the best part of my job, writing menus, discovering ingredients, cooking new ingredients, telling a story through a menu, either it be a story of activism, a story of whatever I'm thinking about, whatever the topical thing I'm thinking about. But I think the more, and I don't know why restaurants and the chefs have to deal with so many like issues. In addition to doing their artwork, they have to, deal with, labor. They have to deal with the environment. I'm like, is there any other job where you have to be responsible and accountable for all these things at once and get paid so little? But for me, fine dining, the change is in guest services and the way our team is. And that's what I work on the outside that people can see the most, or they can and cannot see. So in regards to the guest experience, I want to change that. I think fine dining, what happens in fine dining is there's a lot of one-way performances. And I feel like for me, at least, what I want to do is I want to dance and be a dialogue, be transparent about the issues in the real world. Even though you're taking people away and putting them in an oasis, I still want them to realize, hey, we're still very real. We're still going to quote unquote fuck up. We're not going to fold your napkins every time. We're not going to pour your water every time, because we have other things that are more important. But we're going to talk to you about this, and you're a part of this experience. You're part of this it's not a one-way performance. So I want to change that in terms of service. Then in terms of working, I think the tip issue is, I think the tipping thing holds back our industry a lot. It came out of racism, it came out of being of service and, getting paid for dancing and being a dancing performer. And it's still that. And I think it's really fucked up. So I'm really trying to change that. It's hard, but I'm trying to change it all the time. I think for me, it's like, how do you get people out of that tipping system? The employees, not the guests. Like, how do you get them to think about that differently? And it's been really hard hiring people and having them think about that. And so those are the things I'm working on in fine dining. It's like, and then food wise, it's like, of course, we're always gonna, push ourselves. That's a given. But
yeah, it's really hard because it's true. You think about diner expectations, but you forget the employee expectation side of the tipping thing too. It's sort of like there's just this idea that this is how, especially if you're working front of house, it's different for back of house. But if you're working front of house, it's like your whole focus is actually on the tips. And so I'm also thinking, as you said, about how if you run a restaurant, the number of things you're responsible for. And during the pandemic, it just got even worse because it was like you also were responsible for making it help, like, you know, a safe environment health wise. And it was like, we are not doctors. We are not, you know,
Environmentalists. Yeah,
and
we're not
again,
scientists.
because no one knew enough, there were no real, you know, standards or regulations being put in place. And on the one hand, we were being told that restaurants were like the most dangerous place to go for COVID. And on the other hand, it was like, well, we'll just let chefs figure that out. We'll let them, you know, and it's like, I don't think, you know, people didn't think about even just things like how much it costs for a restaurant to go buy heat lamps, you know, to go, and then the environmental impact of heat lamps. Like no one thought about that stuff, because again, at that point, it was like, we just want to survive. How could you be responsible for that? But it's just like, when you start to think of that kind of pressure, and this is why I've always said that restaurants kind of like art galleries. It's a business that it doesn't have any business being a business. If you look at it structurally, it just doesn't. And if you look at a lot of the original restaurants, they were really just these small family run things. You know, it wasn't about having employees and figuring out fair wages. And it was very kind of like hand to mouth, and it's the family running the kitchen and front of house. And like, that's not a business model. That's not a model, you know. And I blame Danny Meyer, because Danny Meyer's success in sort of creating a restaurant group, and then subsequently with Shake Shack, but what it created was this ability for certain chefs and restaurateurs to have big enough businesses that they then would be accountable for certain laws and regulations that your average restaurant, which is just someone owns one restaurant, they don't own multiple restaurants, it's a small restaurant, it's a local small restaurant, they can't, it's awful that they can't afford to let people take like the Family Leave Act. But if you look at it, the Family Leave Act in most states, your business has to be of a certain size to even account for that law, right? So it wasn't until we started having these mega restaurant groups and these huge restaurants that it was even possible for restaurants to have to comply. And as soon as people started to see that restaurants could be big business, it really changed the expectations for what those businesses became responsible for, without really looking at how big they were. It was just like suddenly across the board, all restaurants need to do this thing. And it's like, restaurants literally aren't cut out to do that thing, even if you think it's the right thing to do. They just aren't built structurally to support that. So it's a huge problem. And a lot of it actually comes down to, like, I hate to say like legislature, but it does a lot of this stuff, you know.
You nailed it. And it's cultural, you know, and it's cultural and it's like communication, and it's cultural zeitgeist, because everyone holds restaurants accountable, how big or small, to the same expectation as you would hold a Danny Meyer and to McDonald's. And I think that's really unfair. I really love small mom and pop places, and that's really what I wanted with Porridge and Puffs. I really wanted that. And I'm just like, you know what, when we show up, we show up. My team shows up, great, we feed people, we love people, you know, the overhead's low. When I cook, we eat. It was really simple, and that's what mom and pop places are. And what mom and pop places have done, in addition to being a neighborhood, the soul of a neighborhood, they were able to move, mostly it's immigrant families and people of color, and it's able for them to move their family to the next socioeconomic class, or to provide education. I know so many Vietnamese family who, you know, and people of color who opened a restaurant so they can put their sweat equity in it. They made no money, but they together, their kids work for free, so they can make that transaction of working for free, so you have money for college, so the kids didn't have to go work for someone else, you know, for $5 an hour, you know. And it's just because that's the way you, as a family, you change your socioeconomic standing in a capitalist world. But that model does not work when you have employees. That model does not work at all in the way capitalism works, you know, the way with Amazon and Shake Shack in the world. However,
or with gentrification. I mean,
or with-
also you lose the connection of restaurants feeding their community too. You know, like that idea that if you're a mom and pop Vietnamese restaurant, you're opening in your own neighborhood, which is probably a neighborhood where other Vietnamese families are living. And so it's not just that you're able to, you know, earn a living and move forward. It's that you're also providing a certain kind of comfort and taste of home for other people who are coming from the same place.
And it's a very complex issue, though, you know, because if you come from that family and all of a sudden you decide to continue that family business, but change it and make it look a little different, you get accused of gentrification. That happens a lot. Like it happens in Chinatown. It happens in places in LA that people don't think about, you know? So I think the gentrification issue is very, very complex. And I think that's something that we don't think about. You know, for Asian Americans, there is like right now, there's, you know, situations where there's accusations of gentrification, but I'm like, wait, their family's been there the whole time. The kid did go to a fancy college, but decided to come back to that neighborhood and run the family restaurant. How is that wrong?
And invest in the neighborhood. And again, it's also, I mean, the thing is, you can look at that and you can call it out, but you can also look at what I call in New York City, we have all these faux nouveau mom and pop restaurants where there's in their press release, any real mom and pop restaurant, there's no press release. Let's get that straight. Yeah. In the press release, they're telling you how, oh, we're just a humble neighborhood restaurant and we really want to revive the mom and pop tradition. And they're doing it like they're making it up as they go. They don't actually come from any kind of background of mom and popping. So they just think it sounds twee and comforting and it's on trend. And if so, in my opinion, if anyone should get called out, that's what you call out. You don't call out someone who came from that community, did better, and then in that state of having done better and learned all of these things, comes back to, you know, establish a restaurant that looks like the next generation restaurant because they are the next generation of that community. There's something that's very organic about that actually. Yeah. But yeah, I see. Okay, wait, is it time for questions?
Yes, time for questions.
Okay, all right. So Kimberly is asking if either of us can reflect on the roles of food journalists in elevating the experiences or narratives of women chefs, cooks, bakers, etc. What sort of training do you think food journalists should receive, and their editors too? I kind of feel like you should answer that. I always feel like I would love to see a conference where chefs interviewed the journalists instead of the other way around, and you grilled us on what we do. So I don't know if you want to take this one first. You know, I can happily answer it, but I think you're the person being covered. What would you like from the people covering you?
First and foremost, I don't want them just to cover me because I'm a woman. I want them to cover me because my work and what I stand for is strong enough on itself, to be honest with you. And so how do you train people to have that? How do you think, you know, you should be trying to look at lens to just, you know, equality and equity. Equity is different from equality. It doesn't mean that everyone's equal. It means that there's something missing, but you cover it in a way that seems like you're balancing it out. And how do you think it should be done, Charlotte? I mean,
I think it should be done where you're not telling people that's what you're doing and you just do it. I can only say in what I try and do, I mean, I think there was a point where it actively had to be called out. I mean, when people were saying, where are the women chefs? There are no women chefs, and there clearly are and were and have been. Then you feel like you want to raise your hand and actually say, okay, like you need to be pointed in this direction in a very obvious way, because there's a whole, I mean, that's where we get into, you know, erasure and stuff where it's just like, but these people are actually here. So, okay, let's like back up and do that. But I think now it's more, if you look at most of my work, sometimes the topic just, it makes it hard. But in most of my work, if you look at who's quoted, you will notice, if you're paying attention, that it's almost always majoritarily women. Sometimes it's all women. And that's very deliberate on my part, you know, especially if it's a field where I just did a story about making jam and safety and health, which was like a real nightmare. And it was, you know, you have to talk to a scientist. And for me, it was, I am going to make sure I speak to a female scientist, because everyone assumes, like everyone thinks I should talk to Harold McGee. Why do they think that? You know, so I think for me, it's that, but it's also, I mean, when I did the anthology, that was all women. And that was more about my trying to, I feel like we're so fettered. And this is true for chefs, and it's true for journalists and writers. We are so fettered down by expected narratives and just by not having been in charge. And we just don't always get the freedom to say what we want the way we want to say it, to write what we want the way we want to write it, to cook what we want the way we want to cook it. And I wanted to make a case that if you gave that freedom, if you gave a bunch of women that freedom in a space that was outside the space of like a regular publication that was its own thing, its own little world, that we would do something extraordinary. And I really, I mean, obviously I'm biased, it was my book, but it was very collaborative. So the extraordinariness isn't coming from me, it's coming from the fact that it's all of these people coming together and, you know, and their voices. And I also think that can be really powerful. So I do think that there are ways to do things that are all women, but I think you have to ask yourself why you're doing them. I did not care. I thought it would be nice if men read that book, but I did not care if men read that book. I really wanted to do something that was like focused on my people, my community. Yeah. And so I do think that there's some of that. I do sometimes think that there's you know, this sort of like, I want to give back to my community. And in my mind, my community are really the women in the food industry. I don't necessarily think of the men as part of that community in the same sense. I just don't. So, yeah.
And I think for me, I always was told, you know, this goes back to very childhood, you know, write what you love and what you know about. And I think if as humans, we just love women a little bit more and the woman point of view and understand it more, that's what we're going to write about, period. And it's just incorporated. It doesn't have to be forced. I want us to get to the place where, you know what, there's just so many choices. It doesn't matter their gender. There's so many choices of great chefs. And they so happen to be a lot of women and they're represented. And I think
you have to, I think in order to get to that place, and this is what we're talking about, equity, you have to sort of the same way I think we need modern journalism, we need new publications, you know, we need to, the only way to really knock the establishment is if you throw so many other successful different models out there so that it just becomes this, you know, smorgasbord of places you can go to read exceptional content. And they all look really, really different. Kind of in the same way that like, if I can flood my stories with female spokespeople, it starts to shift the scale a little bit. So there's this thing now too, where I'm like, we just have to inundate, like we have to inundate. And we don't necessarily have to say that's what we're doing. We just need to do that. So it's like the more talented women you can see like starting things, the more also just non-white people you can see starting things, like all of that. You just, I don't know, I feel like I want to flood it. Okay, we have, oh, and I guess I should just say that as a journalist and looking at editors and how we behave, I am old school in that I believe in a checks and balances system. So I believe in, and I wish we lived in an economy that cared enough about the news in a real way so that the money could come back into that. There should be fact-checking departments. I shouldn't be fact-checking the story I wrote because I'm going to be biased about what I wrote and protective of the things I thought were facts. Honestly, I could do my best job fact-checking, but there's always going to be this thing of, but I thought, wait, you know, copy editors are invaluable. You know, you want multiple readers of stories, and now you want it even more because you want to make sure that your perspective isn't, you know, myopic in any way. So I feel like what I think is important for journalists. I think it's important to be curious. It's important to be thorough. But I think, yeah, it's really, really important to have those checks and balances there. And personally, I like editors who actually edit. Editors who are project managers, I don't get it. That's not an editor, that's a project manager. Okay, question for you. What's next for Phenokite?
Oh, it's such a good question. I have so much to share with you guys. So Phenokite is going to be hopefully for a very, very long time. We're going to keep leaning into art, and I'm thinking of all the fun things I want to do with it. And it's really a very personal project for me. But I think something also very personal to me, and I promised people I was going to tell them, we're making a very big announcement, and you heard it here first. We're reopening Porridge and Puffs, and we are doing it at Second Home. It'll happen, hopefully, the public will hear something hopefully before the end of this month. It is our birthday month. September is when Porridge and Puffs opened. You know, 8 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, Porridge and Puffs, the brick and mortar, opened about 3 years ago. Phenokite also opened in September. Back to school is really big for me. It's when I think, so Porridge and Puffs will be back. I'm super excited. And we will definitely be back in our hi-fi home by early next year, if not before. So really big news for you guys. I'm super excited. Just find me some people to work with me. I'm really short-staffed. As soon as I can figure that out, all the things will be opened. We have the diners, we have the guests I'm so thankful for, and we have the journalists who are supporting us, and we have all the net to support us. We just need team members.
I'm so excited. Really, 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 really excited about that.
Where should people send their
Where should people send their CVs? We're really easy to get a hold of. It's phenakitela@gmail.com. PHENAKITELA@gmail.com. Yes, send us emails, send us everything. We love having them.
We have what? Can we answer the last question? Is that possible? There's one more. I just feel bad. Okay, so this question is: do you think the pandemic has permanently changed the way we experience fine dining?
The pandemic permanently changed a lot of things, and that includes fine dining. Because I think it's how we decide to spend our money and our time, and with whom. And I hope we continue to be more conscious of how we do that. So, I think it's all. I think it's the best time to live. Don't quote me on it. I'm not being glib about it. I really think it's a time to reflect, and a lot of great ideas and innovation is about ready to happen.